want to warn those people who have been campaigning our coffee value addition efforts. I need to warn them. They must stop. We know who they are and who are behind them. They want us to continue exporting raw materials. They want us to continue exporting unprocessed coffee.
Europe thought it controlled the coffee trade. For decades, it set prices, dictated quality standards, and decided who profited from Africa's beans, but Uganda quietly changed the rules. Factories were built, processing stayed local, contracts were rewritten, control shifted from buyers to producers. This wasn't a rebellion, it was strategy. Europe wasn't shut out overnight, it was outmaneuvered. Reliability, quality, and value now flowed on Uganda's terms, and in a market long assumed to be Europe's domain, the center of gravity had quietly moved. The question isn't if Europe can respond, the question is if it ever will. The moment did not arrive with sirens or speeches. It unfolded through contracts rewritten, shipment terms adjusted, and a quiet recalibration of power that few outside the industry noticed at first. Uganda, long treated as a reliable but replaceable supplier, had changed the rules of the coffee trade. Europe felt the impact before. It fully understood the cause. For decades, the global coffee system followed a familiar pattern. African producers exported raw beans, European markets controlled pricing, branding, roasting, and distribution. Value accumulated far from the farms where the coffee was grown. Uganda fit neatly into that structure, shipping volume outward while importing finished goods back at a premium. It was efficient, it was stable, and it left little room for negotiation. That balance no longer held. Uganda's shift began not with confrontation, but with coordination. Agricultural policy, export licensing, logistics investment, and domestic processing were aligned toward a single objective: retain value at the source. New facilities emerged near growing regions, reducing transit time and loss. Quality control improved through standardized grading systems. Export criteria tightened. Only beans meeting higher thresholds moved forward. Europe noticed delays first. Shipments arrived later than expected. Volumes fluctuated. Prices edged upward. Buyers assumed seasonal variation or logistical friction, but the pattern persisted. Uganda was no longer flooding the market, it was selecting it. The next change came through contracts. Uganda renegotiated long-term supply agreements, shifting from spot market dependence to structured partnerships. Pricing formulas adjusted to include processing value. Delivery terms reflected upgraded quality standards. Risk was redistributed. European buyers accustomed to dictating terms found themselves negotiating. This was the shock. Not because Europe lacked alternatives, but because the assumption of leverage had been built into every layer of the trade. Uganda's move exposed how much of that leverage rested on habit rather than necessity. Domestic capacity played a central role. Uganda expanded roasting, packaging, and branding capabilities aimed not only at export markets but at regional consumption. Coffee stopped being exclusively an outward flow. Local demand absorbed part of the supply, stabilizing prices and reducing urgency to sell at unfavorable terms. That internal buffer changed everything. With less pressure to offload harvests immediately, Uganda gained time. Time allowed selectivity. Selectivity translated into influence. Europe responded cautiously. Importers explored alternative sources, blends adjusted, but quality consistency proved difficult to replicate at scale. Uganda's profile had been embedded deeply into supply chains, especially for specific varieties favored by European consumers. Substitution carried costs. As negotiations continued, Uganda introduced traceability. Requirements. Environmental and labor standards were formalized not as concessions but as conditions. This reframed compliance from burden to differentiation. Coffee from Uganda carried guarantees Europe increasingly needed to demonstrate. The narrative inverted. Instead of Europe setting standards for African producers, Uganda set standards European buyers had to meet to maintain access. This was not symbolic, it was operational. Ports were optimized for processed exports, digital documentation streamlined customs clearance, financial arrangements shifted to favor longer-term settlement, reducing exposure to volatile pricing cycles. Uganda's government coordinated closely with cooperatives and exporters, ensuring policy consistency. Fragmentation had historically weakened producer leverage, alignment strengthened it. Europe's internal discussions reflected unease. Coffee had always been treated as a secure import. Supply disruptions were rare, competition abundant. Uganda's strategy challenged that complacency. It did not threaten scarcity, it threatened predictability. Markets dislike unpredictability. As uncertainty grew, premiums emerged. Uganda captured them. Farmers saw improved incomes. Investment flowed back into production. Quality improved further. The cycle reinforced itself. Other producing countries watched closely. Uganda's approach did not rely on scale alone. It relied on coherence that made it replicable. Conversations shifted across Africa about value retention, contract structure, and market positioning. Europe sensed the broader implication. If Uganda could assert control without exiting the system, others could follow. The coffee trade could fragment into negotiated relationships rather than standardized extraction. The balance of power was shifting quietly. Uganda did not announce a takeover. It executed one through competence. By controlling more stages of the value chain, it reduced dependency on distant decision makers by coordinating policy. And industry, it spoke with one voice. Europe adjusted rhetoric. Partnership language replaced procurement language, sustainability initiatives expanded, investment proposals surfaced, but the dynamic had changed. Engagement was now a conversation, not an instruction. This shift resonated beyond coffee. Uganda demonstrated that control does not require confrontation, it requires preparation, infrastructure. Before negotiation, capacity before leverage. The global coffee deal was not seized in a single moment. It was reshaped through a series of rational choices that accumulated into strategic dominance over time. Europe was not excluded, it was rebalanced. And in that rebalancing, Uganda moved from the margins of the global coffee economy to its negotiating center, not by rejecting the system, but by mastering it on its own terms. The second phase of the transformation unfolded not in public forums, but inside systems Europe rarely examined closely. Once Uganda consolidated control over processing and contract terms, attention shifted from price to structure. The coffee trade was no longer just about who supplied beans, but about who governed the rules of exchange. Uganda refined export quotas with precision. Volumes were aligned to market absorption rather than harvest size. This prevented price crashes that had historically benefited buyers at the expense of producers. Warehousing capacity expanded to support this discipline, allowing stockpiles to be released strategically rather than urgently. Time became an asset instead of a threat. Europe felt the change through margins. Roasters faced tighter spreads. Long-term contracts required commitments rather than flexibility. Spot market advantages diminished. What had once been an asymmetrical relationship flattened into negotiation. Uganda's internal coordination deepened. Farmer cooperatives were integrated into planning. Cycles. Quality incentives replaced volume incentives. Training programs aligned cultivation methods with market demand rather than maximum yield. This reduced waste and elevated consistency. The coffee itself changed, flavor profiles stabilized, traceability improved, defects declined. Uganda's product became less interchangeable and more distinctive in a market driven increasingly by differentiation. This mattered. Europe attempted to adapt through diversification. Imports from other regions increased marginally. Blends were reformulated. Marketing emphasized variety, but Uganda's role proved harder to dilute than expected. Consumer preferences had been shaped over decades. Substitution introduced risk. That risk translated into caution. European buyers accepted higher prices in exchange for reliability. Uganda's leverage grew not through scarcity but through trust. Reliability, once assumed, was now conditional. Financial structures adjusted accordingly. Payment terms shortened. Currency exposure was managed jointly rather than imposed unilaterally. Investment flowed into Ugandan infrastructure not as aid but as partnership, ownership. Structures shifted to reflect shared risk. This marked a psychological shift. Europe no longer viewed Uganda as an upstream supplier, it viewed it as a stakeholder. That distinction altered behavior across the value chain. Uganda used this position carefully. There was no rush to maximize revenue. Stability remained the priority. The goal was not dominance but durability. Each adjustment was incremental, reducing the likelihood of backlash while solidifying gains. Other African countries observed the outcome with interest. Uganda's success reframed what control looked like. It did not involve nationalization or exclusion. It involved coordination, patience, and standards enforcement. The model appealed to countries wary of disruption but eager for leverage. Regional discussions intensified, shared processing facilities were explored, export alignment gained traction, collective bargaining, once fragmented by competition, began to re-emerge as a possibility. Europe recognized the trend. Coffee was no longer an isolated case, it was a signal. If similar strategies emerged in cocoa, tea, or other commodities, the cumulative effect would reshape trade dynamics significantly. Policy conversations in Europe shifted tone, resilience replaced efficiency as a guiding principle, dependence was acknowledged as a risk, supply chains were reevaluated not just for cost but for governance. Exposure. Uganda's role in these conversations was implicit but undeniable. It had demonstrated that agency did not require scale alone. It required clarity of purpose and execution discipline. The United States watched from a distance. American firms were less exposed to Ugandan coffee, but the implications extended beyond the product. The case illustrated how producer countries could assert influence without confronting global systems directly. That lesson resonated across commodities. Uganda's domestic impact continued to compound, rural incomes stabilized, investment cycles lengthened. Youth participation in agriculture increased as profitability improved. Coffee regained status as a strategic sector rather than a survival activity. This internal stability reinforced external credibility. Partners trusted consistency rooted in domestic alignment. Uganda's commitments held because internal incentives supported them. Europe adapted gradually. Joint ventures increased, co-branding initiatives emerged, research collaboration expanded, engagement shifted from transactional to relational, the power dynamic had recalibrated. Uganda did not dictate terms unilaterally, it shaped the environment in which terms were set. That distinction ensured sustainability. Over time, the shock faded into a new normal. Markets adjusted, analysts revised assumptions. The coffee trade stabilized around a more balanced distribution of value, yet the lesson endured. Control in global trade does not always announce itself through disruption. Sometimes it emerges quietly through competence, coordination, and patience. Uganda's transformation was neither accidental nor confrontational, it was deliberate. And by the time Europe fully understood the shift, the structures supporting it were already in place. The global coffee deal had not been seized in a single move. It had been earned through alignment between policy, production, and purpose. In redefining its role, Uganda did not reject the global market, it reshaped it.